Okay, so we talked about political culture, and now the second thing we want to talk about more specifically is political trust. And this is where we get into this important concept of social capital. And here's where there's a key author, Robert Putnam. You really can't talk about social capital without talking about Putnam. He pretty much wrote the book on this. Obviously, it came from a long line of political scientists and sociologists thinking about this issue of social trust, but Putnam is really the name that gets associated with this idea of social capital, especially in the American context. So he's written books on this, but what I've given you today is an article from the Journal of Democracy. Note that it's from 95, so it's a little bit older, but it's a really good summary of how he emerged to talk about these issues of social capital in the American context. All right, so he starts off with this problem. We know that you need to have a strong and active civil society in order to have a strong democracy. We saw that in the democratization videos that I did. But then he notes that, unfortunately, civil society in America has declined. And why is that the case? We have this problem here. And this is really uncharacteristic of what we would think of America. So he brings up Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So essentially, let's just move over here. Tocqueville was this French guy around the time of the American, probably about, well, I guess it says right here, 1831. And he was like, okay, so America seems to be really good at this democracy thing. Why is this the case? So he essentially said, I'm going to head over to America. I'm going to study them and see what the heck they're doing right. And he said democracies thrive because of a robust civil society. So people in America are forming associations like clubs, organizations, all these sorts of things. And they're doing it for a variety of different reasons, not just, specifically political clubs. It's leisure clubs and, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and all those sorts of things, although I'm not sure Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts existed in 1831. But point being, they were forming all of these sorts of associations, and he says this is what is making American democracy so robust. They have such a robust civil society because of these civil organizations that they have made. Anyway, so he publishes this book, Democracy in America. You can read it. It's obviously very long. So probably don't go read the entire thing. But point being, this is kind of the basis of America kind of patting itself on the back and saying, hey, we're a pretty strong democracy. It's because we have this strong civil society. All right, so let's go back to Putnam. So people have noted that this is the case. So the idea is that when your community is civically engaged, and all sorts of good stuff happens. You get better health outcomes. You get better economies, lower crimes, because people are invested in each other. It also influences the quality of government. And so Putnam does a study, one of his earlier studies. Let's bring you over here, from 94. He does this book on making democracy work, civic traditions in modern Italy. And he says, how come it is that certain democratic governments do great and other democratic governments don't? So similar to the question that Tocqueville had, why is America so great? And so Putnam did this comparative study of Italian regions, and he focused on this. And he said, the different Italian regions that are doing the best are the ones that have this sense of civil society, that they tend to be invested in each other and invested in civil society. And they're the ones that are doing well economically, that have really good democratic governance in each of these regions. And so he says, so here's the deal. What seems to define really good quality democracy and a variety of important outcomes, from health outcomes to economic outcomes, crime, all that kind of stuff, is this idea of social capital, which is this key term. So social capital, let's just highlight this here, refers to the features of social organizations such as networks, norms, and social trust, and we're going to talk a lot about trust today, that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefits. So the idea is it contains a few key aspects. The first is trust, that we're going to trust each other, and therefore we're going to be more willing to work together, where there's going to be more opportunities for collaboration, and really turns into collective turning towards collective benefits rather than individual benefits. So rather than an I, it turns into a we. And this is what allows democracy and a variety of other different factors to thrive. So he sets this up and then he says, but then what happened? What happened to civic engagement? Why do we kind of suck at this social capital thing now? And he says there seems to be this odd decline in American society today. There's decreasing voter turnout. People aren't attending public meetings. People aren't joining political parties. Why is there no more civic engagement? You can probably guess what he's going to say is the answer. We also get lower trust in government. People just don't seem to trust government. And he says that part of this is a decline in social capital. So this idea that Americans just aren't joining things like they used to. There aren't these sense of networks that we used to have. Especially right here, he talks a lot about how we used to join, or Americans used to join religious groups, and now we know that that has declined. There's also been a decline in people taking part in labor unions. People are not, taking charge in the PTA anymore. Other groups like women's clubs, Boy Scouts, for example, are not as popular. People just aren't joining organizations. They're not building those sorts of networks required for social capital. And so he says that we have turned into a much more individual society as opposed to the collective. And this is where he comes up with this term, bowling alone, that gives the title for this article and then also the broader book. So let me just pop over here. Yeah, Bowling Alone. So this is a very, very, very popular book about social capital in American society. And the idea is, and I'm just going to, there we go, right here. So the rise of solo bowling. So he uses bowling as this example of, how this epitomizes how America has changed. The rise of solo bowling threatens the livelihood of bowling lane proprietors because those who bowl as members of leagues consume 3 times as much beer and pizza as solo bowlers. Now, the important part is, though, that the social interaction and civic conversations that happen over beer and pizza are what we are lacking, therefore. It's not necessarily just that there's less beer and pizza consumption. It's that this kind of social interactions that happen when people are in bowling leagues, when they're bowling in clubs, aren't happening when you go to a bowling lane by yourself. And this is the big problem in American democracy. Okay. He says, yeah, but some people would say, well, maybe there are other forms of participation that are replacing these traditional sorts of bowling leagues. Maybe people just don't like to bowl in leagues anymore. What about other groups? So, for example, environmental groups, feminist groups, tertiary organizations, so things like, patrons of the Met Art Gala or whatever. And he says, yeah, but these things are not about meeting together to do something. It's about mass membership, or it's controlled from on high. It's not actually sort of giving people a training ground for civic engagement. So these aren't really filling the slack of these old school bowling leagues. Another example of things that might happen is, we do have a rise in self-help groups. So things like Alcoholics Anonymous. And he says, yeah, but this is focused on the inward. It's on the self, not on the outward in the community. So that's not really going to build the sort of social capital that we want to build otherwise. And so he says, our issue now is that we, have less bonds with our family. Sure, we have less contact with our neighbors. And in turn, we get, because of all of these sorts of things, we are less contact with other people through these associations, these networks. We're going to end up trusting other people less. And so it's very important to think about this term generalized trust and why it's so important for political society. So let's head over here. So the way that we often understand political trust is this particular survey question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you need to be very careful in dealing with people? And so this is the survey question that comparatively we've started using as a way of understanding social capital. We've kind of pinpointed this as the key thing that's going to help us understand a level of social capital, a level of generalized trust in a society. And so this question has been asked in so many different surveys all over the world as a way to try to pinpoint this really difficult concept, right? It's very hard to measure, how much social capital you have. It's not like other types of capital where you can just put a dollar figure to it, right? So they say, well, if we know that trust is the key part, building these networks, building this sort of trust in each other, well, then maybe we can ask people about how much they trust each other as a way to measure social capital. So again, this would harken back to our study of concepts and measures. So the concept is social capital, and we're measuring it through generalized trust. So I'm going to send you to this, Our World in Data page. It's actually really interesting. You can see how generalized trust has changed over time, how it changes or how it looks between different countries, who's the most trusting, who's the least trusting. It's not necessarily where you think it would be. And was there one more thing that I wanted to take a look at? And also how it relates to trust in government and how that has decreased over time in the United States and then elsewhere. So I'll send you over there just to take a general look at some of the data that we have about generalized trust. But let's get back to Putnam's argument. So Americans are less trusting. So why is this the case? Why is social capital eroding in America? So first theory, well, maybe because women have moved into the labor force, they aren't, running PTAs and all that kind of stuff anymore. And because they're working, they're too busy. But Putnam says, well, probably not, because men's groups have also declined over this period of time. So it's not just about women's liberation. He says, what about mobility? Maybe people are moving around more. They're moving out to the suburbs. They don't have the sense of community that they used to. But actually, he says, well, in the same time period, stability has actually increased. More people are buying homes, living in the same spot. So he says, okay, well, here's maybe two other answers that have a bit more credence. The first is other demographic transformations. People are not getting married as much. People are getting divorced more often. They have fewer children. And they say, well, it's married middle-class parents that are generally more involved that in these sorts of organizations. And so maybe that's part of it. He says, this is probably a good area to look into. And the other thing is the technological transformation of leisure. It's the idea of our leisure time becoming individualized because we can just sit and watch TV or be on the internet or whatever kind of thing you're doing. He even says, you'll get virtual reality and then you won't need to hang out with other human beings. And that, he says, yeah, maybe that might be influencing this decline in social capital. So what is to be done? And I would say this is more of a question, not about how do we fix this social capital issue, more of a what should scholars be studying? And the great thing is this was written in 95, so we can actually say that scholars have studied a lot of these things since then. The first thing is different dimensions of social capital. So since Putnam's written, there's been a large explosion of studies looking at different types of social capital, so bridging versus bonding. So the idea of bridging social capital is you're engaged in organizations that are helping you build between different groups. So like the bowling league, right? You're going to get people from different walks of life because they're all interested in bowling, and people like bowling from a variety of social backgrounds, right? Versus bonding or within groups. You have a specific ethnic or religious group that is going to be they're associating with each other, they're forming these networks, but it's really bonding and not building those sorts of bridges between different groups that we need in order to have greater trust in our neighbors, in the variety of people who might be different from us. And that's what is really building this civil society. So there's been a great deal of research about the different types of social capital and the fact that, maybe not all social capital is great. Maybe this bonding social capital where you are building networks, but it's within your in-group is not as useful. The second thing he says is we really need to study the impact of technology. And a lot of scholars have looked at the impact of technology on political activity, for example. And, it takes much less effort to go and like a post on Facebook than it does to go to a protest, than it goes to get yourself registered and go to vote. And some people have seen this as part of the reason we have a decline in things like the more difficult types of political engagement, like going out to vote. And that, some of the technology has diluted political activity, or it's made it less robust because it's much easier to do something online and you don't really need to engage in that. He also says, well, maybe there was never really a golden age of great social capital, that it was this kind of bonding, closely knit communities. So we talked about bonding social capital. Maybe that's what the kind of social capital we used to have was, and it wasn't actually this kind of bridging social capital that we want to build in order to improve American life or American society. And the last thing is, how does public policy impact social capital? So can you legislate social capital? And there's been some studies about that. How do you actually build social capital? I love this example. A recent proposal that requires all new houses to have front porches so that people will talk to each other. So is there a way that we can legislate social capital, that we can legislate people building bridges between each other? Public education is one of those sorts of ways. So in a variety of different domains, we're studying how we can build social capital. And then the last question is, does this extend beyond America? And if we go back to these charts, we can see that it's not just in the United States that that trust is lower than we'd like to think. It's not just an American phenomenon. You can see actually generalized trust is much lower in a lot of different areas, and then higher in say Norway or China. So it's very interesting to see where is it that people have generalized trust, and lots of studies have tried to figure out why is it that certain places have greater trust than others. So here's another response, another chart on that in European countries. So that's kind of the gist of Putnam and Bowling Alone. You can obviously read the entire book or any of his books if you're more interested in this issue. But this is really a seminal work. The book version, at least, is a seminal work in the issue of social capital and building political trust as part of political culture. So that's what we have for that today. So let's stop there.